Namaskar listeners, we are back again with another very important and very interesting episode which took place in Indian history in the modern period, and this was popular resistance to the British rule in India. Now, before we really start the lesson and the discussion, I must tell you the reasons why the Britishers came to India. Now, around the 18th century, a number of significant events took place in the world. One such event was the Industrial Revolution, which took place in England. Now, this revolution spread to other countries of Europe also. You must have read about the Industrial Revolution in an earlier episode also. Now, at this time, some interesting events also took place, and one of them was discovery of new trade and sea routes. Now, one such sea route to India was discovered by a Portuguese called Vasco da Gama in 1498. As a result, the English, the French, the Portuguese, and the Dutch came to India for trade purposes. They also used it to spread missionary activities in India. Now, what was this? This was spread of Christianity in India. Do you know that the beginning of modern period in history began with the coming of these European powers to India? Now, let us look into the reasons for their coming to India. The Europeans and the British traders initially came to India for trading purposes. Now, the Industrial Revolution in Britain led to the increase in demand for raw materials for the factories there. At the same time, they also required a market to sell their finished goods. India provided such a platform to Britain to fulfill all their needs. The 18th century was a period of internal power struggle in India, and with the declining power of the Mughal Empire, the British officials were provided with the perfect opportunity to establish their hold over Indian territory. They did these through numerous wars, forced treaties, annexations, and alliances with the various regional powers all over the country. Their new administrative and economic policies helped them consolidate their control over the country. Their land revenue policies helped them keep the poor farmers in check and get huge sums as revenues in return. They forced the commercialization of agriculture with the growing of various cash crops and the raw materials for the industries in Britain. With the strong political control, the British were able to monopolize the trade with India. They defeated their foreign rivals in trade so that there could be no competition. They monopolized the sale of all kinds of raw materials and brought these at low prices, whereas the Indian weavers had to buy them at exorbitant prices. Heavy duties were imposed on Indian goods entering Britain so as to protect their own industry. Various investments were made to improve the transport and communication system in the country to facilitate the easy transfer of raw materials from the farms to the port and of finished goods from the ports to the markets. Also, English education was introduced to create a class of educated Indians who would assist the British in ruling the country and strengthen their political authority. Do you know that all these measures helped the British to establish, consolidate, and continue their rule over India? Now, British colonial rule had a tremendous impact on all sections of Indian society. Can you imagine being ruled by some strangers year after year? No, we cannot. Most of us were born after 1947, when India had already become independent. Do you know, when the British conquered India and colonized its economy, they faced stiff resistance from the people. there were a series of civil rebellions. These rebellions were led by rulers who were deposed by the Britishers. Ex-officials of the conquered Indian states impoverished zamindars and polygars. It brought together people having different ethnic, religious and class background against the British rule. Now we should be able to discuss about some of these important popular uprisings, their nature and their importance. Can you think of a reason why these resistance movements are called popular? Was it because of the large number of people who participated in them? Or was it because of the success they met with? Why people resist? They resist when they feel that their rights are being taken away. That means all resistance movements started against some form of exploitation. British rule, whose policies had undermined rights, status and economic position of Indians, symbolized this exploitation. The protest and resistance was mainly offered by the displaced ruling classes, peasantry and tribals. For example, when warring Hastings attacked Benares and imprisoned Chet Singh to fulfill his unjustified demand of money and army, the people of Benares rebelled. In Madras Presidency, polygars rebelled when the British tried to snatch away their military and land rights. Interference in religious practices also was a very important cause of these popular rebellions. Often these revolts were anti-Christian. This was due to the socio-religious reforms introduced by the British, which were unacceptable to the people. In some other rebellions, differences were there between the religion of the ruler and the exploited classes became the immediate cause for the rebellion. This happened in Mappila rebellion of Malabar region. Here, the Muslim peasantry fought against the Hindu landlords and moneylenders. Violence and plunder were the two most popular tools used by the rebels to express their resistance against their oppressors. Lower and exploited classes often attacked their exploiters. They were the Britishers or the zamindars or the revenue collecting officials, wealthy groups and individuals. Santhal rebellion saw mass scale violence where account books of moneylenders and government buildings were burnt and their exploiters punished. In the previous episode, we have already discussed about the land policies of the British, the purpose being to extract as much money as possible from the peasants and tribal people. This caused so much unrest among the peasants and the tribals that they started expressing their resentment against the British. It is important to know that these popular resistance movements aimed at restoration of old structures and relations which had been done away with by the British. Each social group had its own reasons to raise its voice against the colonial powers. For example, displaced zamindars and rulers wanted to regain their land and estates. Similarly, the tribal groups rebelled because they did not want the traders and moneylenders to interfere in their lives. You would be surprised to know that beginning with the Sannyasi rebellion and Chinar uprising in Bengal and Bihar in the 1760s, there was hardly a year without an armed opposition. From 1763 to 1856, there were more than 40 major rebellions apart from hundreds of minor ones. Now, these rebellions were, however, local in character and effects. They were isolated from each other because each rebellion had a different motive. You have also read about the various land settlements and the adverse effects they had on the Indian peasantry. The permanent settlement had made the zamindar the owner of the land, but this land could be sold off if he failed to pay the revenue on time. This forced the zamindars and the landlords to extract money from the peasants even if their crops failed. These peasants often borrowed money from the moneylenders, who were also called mahajans. The impoverished peasants could never pay back this borrowed money. This led to many hardships like extreme poverty and being forced to work as bonded laborers. Hence, the lower and exploited classes often attacked their exploiters. Failure to pay by the zamindars also meant that the land would be taken away by the British. The British then would auction this land to the highest bidder. Now, this bidder often came from the urban areas. The new zamindars from the city had little or no interest in the land. They did not invest money in seeds or fertilizers to improve the fertility of the land, but only cared to collect as much revenue as they could. This proved destructive for the peasants, who remained backward and stagnant. To get out of this situation, the peasants now started producing commercial crops like indigo, sugarcane, jute, cotton, opium, and so on. This was the beginning of commercialization of agriculture. The peasants now depended on merchants, traders, and middlemen to sell their produce during harvest time. As they shifted to commercial crops, food grain production went down. Less food stocks led to famines. It was therefore not surprising that the hungry peasants revolted. Now, we shall discuss some of these revolts which took place on account of the British policies. One of the important uprisings and rebellions were the Fakir and Sannyasi rebellions, which took place between 1770 and 1820s. The establishment of British control over Bengal after 1757 led to increase in land revenue and the exploitation of the peasants. The Bengal famine of 1770 led to peasants' revolt whose lands were confiscated, displaced zamindars, disbanded soldiers, and poor people to come together in a rebellious mood. They were joined by the sannyasis and the fakirs. Now, who were these fakirs? These fakirs were a group of wandering Muslim religious mendicants in Bengal. Two famous Hindu leaders who supported them, Bharbhavani Pathak and a woman, Devi Chaudharani. They attacked English factories and seized their goods, cash, arms, and ammunition. Mazloom Shah was one of their prominent leaders. They were finally brought under control by the British at the beginning of the 19th century. The Sannyasi uprising took place in Bengal between the periods of 1770 and 1820s. The Sannyasis rose in rebellion against the Great Famine of 1770 in Bengal, which caused acute chaos and misery. However, the immediate cause of the rebellion was the restrictions imposed by the British upon pilgrims visiting holy places among both Hindus and Muslims. The British adopted many ways through which they could increase their profits, and this led to the Indigo uprising. They started interfering with the basic means of livelihood of the people. Not only did they introduce new crops, they also brought new techniques of farming. Heavy pressure was put on the zamindars and peasants to pay high taxes and grow commercial crops. One such commercial crop was indigo. The cultivation of indigo was determined by the needs of the English cloth market. The discontent of the farmers growing indigo was mainly for three reasons. One of the most important reasons were they were paid very low prices for growing indigo. Secondly, indigo was not at all lucrative as it was planted at the same time as food crops. This led to loss of fertility of the soil because of planting indigo. As a result, food stocks declined. The peasants suffered at the hands of the traders and the middleman on whom they depended to sell their goods, sometimes even at very low prices. They supported the zamindars to maintain their dominance and deal with the problems in administrating these areas. The peasants launched a movement for non-cultivation of indigo in Bengal. Hindus and Muslims together went on strike and filed cases against the planters. They were supported by the press and the missionaries. The government passed orders in November 1860 notifying that it was illegal to force the Rayats to cultivate indigo. This marked the victory for the rebels. And then came the Farazi movement. Now, this Farazi movement took place between 1838 and 1848. This was the first ever no tax campaign against the British government led by Sharitullah Khan and Dadu Mian. Their band of volunteers fought heroically with the armed group of indigo planters and zamindars. It brought together all the cultivators of Bengal against the tyranny and illegal extractions by the landlords. Then the Wahhabi movement. Now, the leader of this movement was Syed Ahmad Barelvi of Rai Bareli, who was greatly influenced by the teachings of Abdul Wahab of Arabia and Shah Walilullah, a Delhi saint. The movement was primarily religious in its origin. It soon assumed the character of a class struggle in some places, especially in Bengal. Irrespective of communal distinctions, peasants united against their landlords. Now, let us see into the significance of these revolts. The aggressive economic policies of the British shattered the traditional agrarian system of India and worsened the condition of the peasants. The peasants' revolt taking place in various parts of the country were mainly directed at these policies. Though these revolts were not aimed at uprooting the British rule from India, they did create awareness among the Indians. They now felt a need to organize and fight against exploitation and oppression. In short, these rebellions prepared the ground for various other uprisings such as the Sikh Wars in Punjab and finally the revolt of 1857. Another group of people who revolted against the British rule were the tribals of India. The tribal groups were an important and integral part of Indian life. Before their annexation and subsequent incorporation in the British territories, they had their own social and economic systems. These systems were traditional in nature and satisfied the needs of the tribals. Each community was headed by a chief who managed the affairs of the community. They also enjoyed independence regarding the management of their affairs. The land and forests were their main source of livelihood. The forest provided them with basic items which they required for survival. The tribal communities remained isolated from the non-tribals. The British policies proved harmful to the tribal society, destroyed their relatively self-sufficient economy and communities. The tribal groups of different regions revolted against the Britishers. Now, this was bound to happen because these movements were anti-colonial in nature because they were directed against the colonial administration. The tribals used traditional weapons, mainly bows and arrows, and often turned violent. The Britishers dealt severely with them. They were declared criminals and antisocial. Their properties were confiscated, they were imprisoned, and many of them were hanged. The tribal movement in India remained confined to some regions only, but it did not lag behind other social groups as regards participation in the anti-colonial movements. We will discuss these movements here. One of them was the Santhal rebellion, which took place between 1855 and 1857. The area of concentration of the Santhals was called Damaneko or Santhal Pargana. It extended from Bhagalpur in Bihar in the north to Orissa in the south, stretching from Hazaribagh to the borders of Bengal. The Santhals, like other tribes, worked hard to maintain their lives in the forest and wild jungles. They cultivated the land and lived a peaceful life, which continued till the British officials brought with them traders, moneylenders, zamindars, and merchants. They were made to buy goods on credit and forced to pay back with a heavy interest during harvest time. As a result, they were sometimes forced to give the Mahajan not only their crops but also plough, bullocks, and finally even the land. Very soon they became bonded labourers and could serve only their creditors. The peaceful tribal communities were now up in arms against the British officials, the zamindars, and the moneylenders who were exploiting them. Sidhu and Kanu were leading Santhal rebel leaders. They gave a heroic fight to the British government. Unfortunately, the Santhal rebellion was crushed in an unequal battle, but it became a source of inspiration for future agrarian struggles. Another important rebellion was the Munda rebellion, 1899-1900. One of the most important and prominent rebellions which took place after 1857 was the Munda rebellion. Now, who were these Mundas? Mundas were a group of tribals who traditionally enjoyed certain rights as the original clearer of the forest, which was not given to the other tribes. But this land system was getting destroyed in the hands of the moneylenders and the merchants long before the coming of the British. But when the British actually came into these areas, they helped to destroy this system with a rapid pace when they introduced contractors and traders. These contractors needed people to work with them as indentured labourers. This dislocation of the Mundas at the hands of the British and the contractors gave birth to the Munda rebellion. The most prominent leader of this rebellion was Birsa Munda, who was more aware than the others as he had received some education from the British missionaries. He encouraged his tribe people to keep the tradition of worshipping of the sacred groves alive. This move was very important to prevent the Britishers from taking over their wastelands. For this, the Birsa Munda fought against the moneylenders, the Mahajans, and the English officials. He attacked police stations, churches, and missionaries. Unfortunately, the rebels were defeated and Munda died in prison soon after in 1900. But his sacrifice did not go in vain. The Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act of 1908 provided some land ownership rights to the people and banned bonded labour of the tribals. Birsa Munda became the architect of Munda rebellion and somebody who is remembered even today. Another very important rebellion which took place during this time between 1860 and the 1870s was the Jaintia and the Garo rebellion. After the first Anglo-Burmese war, the British planned the construction of a road connecting Brahmaputra Valley, that is present day Assam, with Sylhet, that is present day Bangladesh. The Jaintias and the Garos in the northeastern part of India, that is present day Meghalaya, opposed the construction of this road, which was of strategic importance to the British for the movement of troops. In 1827, the Jaintias tried to stop work and soon the unrest spread to the neighbouring Garo hills. Alarmed, the British burnt several Jaintia and Garo villages. The hostilities increased with the introduction of house tax and income tax by the British in 1860s. The Gentia leader Yu Kiang Nong Ba was captured and publicly hanged, and the Garo leader Pa Togan Sangma was defeated by the British. Another uprising which took place during this time was the uprising of the Bhils, which took place between 1818 to 1831. The Bhils were largely concentrated in Khandesh, present day Maharashtra, and Gujarat. Khandesh came under British occupation in 1818. The Bhils considered them as outsiders. On the instigation of Tribankji, rebel minister of Bajirao II, they revolted against the Britishers. Then came the coal uprising, 1831-1832. The coals of Singhbham in the Chota Nagpur area enjoyed autonomy under the chiefs, but the entry of the British threatened their independence. Later, the transfer of tribal lands and the coming of moneylanders, merchants, and the British laws created a lot of tension. This prompted the coal tribe to organize themselves and rebel. The impact was such that the British had to rush troops from far off places to suppress it. The Mappila uprising were the Muslim cultivating tenants, landless labourers, and fishermen of the Malabar region. The British occupation of Malabar region and their new land laws, along with the atrocities of the landlords, mainly Hindus, led to the Mappilas to revolt against the people. It took many years for the British to crush the Mappilas. Thank you so much for joining in and listening to this interesting and important episode.